Hello and welcome to the Sana Psychological Podcast, your safe space for connection, healing, and growth. Each episode, our experienced clinicians and special guests will share strategies, stories, and resources to support your unique path to well-being. Because at Sana, your mental health matters. Welcome to this episode of the Sana Psychological Podcast. I'm your host, Paige Abbott. Today I'm joined for another interesting discussion about Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, or OCD, with Megan Hanrahan. Last time we talked about what OCD is and clarified some of the misconceptions around it. Today we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of treatment. My guest today is Megan Hanrahan. She has been working as a therapist for 6 years and has been a registered psychologist for over 2. She is passionate about working with clients with both anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder, and often draws from her personal experience with both. She's here today to discuss more about the common misconceptions about OCD and strategies for managing it. Welcome back, Megan. I'm so excited to have you here talking again about your specialty of obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. Thank you so much for your willingness to keep talking on this topic.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be back and, to talk a little bit more about OCD.
Yeah. So last episode, we had discussed more so about misconceptions around
Mhm.
OCD, what it can look like in people's lived experience, and just starting to open up more of that realistic dialogue around what OCD is. And I
Mhm.
think once people start doing that for themselves, a natural next question is, okay, so what do I do about it, right? And
Mhm.
so that brings us into the treatment discussion, the therapy discussion, the change discussion. And that's what we're going to be exploring today. So jumping right in, because this is your specialty, you work with it day after
Mhm.
day, hour after hour. I'd love to hear more about how you work with people with OCD.
Yes, that's always a good question. It's the what next, right?
Yeah, totally.
Um, yeah, so with OCD and like I think I'll refer back to our previous episode a little bit, but the first thing I do with clients when I'm working with OCD is self-awareness. It's really important to understand how it shows up for you, and what that looks like. So what we'll do in the first session is we'll talk about themes. So I know I mentioned in the last episode just different types of OCD and how it shows up. So, the common term for that is themes. So what are your themes? And how do you know when OCD is showing up? Right? So some common themes are, contamination, harm, relationship. It can show up in a lot of different areas. So there is a bit of a questionnaire I'll go through with people to start to help them identify how that shows up. And there might be multiple areas. There might just be one that's really kind of distressing and persistent. So we talk about that, and we talk about the cycle that happens and start to label the obsessions and label the compulsions and label those different parts of OCD and how that shows up. And so once we have that understanding, we go through talking about exposure and response prevention. So this is a big part of treatment, is just talking about how this works. It is the evidence-based treatment for OCD. And so that's what I practice with my clients. And it's a different kind of treatment, right? It's basically what you're doing is you're leaning into the anxiety and leaning into the discomfort in order to get to a better place. And I always, try to make sure people really understand that. Because, first couple sessions, sometimes it's, wait, you want me to do that? You want me to make myself uncomfortable? And so if people don't understand why they're doing that, it can be really overwhelming and, people people aren't interested in continuing sometimes, right? Um, and so what that looks like is, the exposure piece. So the exposure piece is all about, first of all, just identifying what the anxiety is, what the thought is. So maybe it's, a common one is contamination. So maybe it's, oh, okay, what if I go into that public washroom, and I, get germs everywhere and then I'm spreading it everywhere. So what we actually do is we lean into that and say, yep, you're going to go in that public washroom anyway. And you're going to sit with that discomfort. And then the response prevention piece is, preventing that normal response, which is the compulsion. So the compulsion in that, situation for a lot of people is excessive hand washing. So maybe they'll go in that public washroom and they're washing their hands for 20 minutes, a certain amount of time. And we essentially, either remove that or we delay it as long as possible, right? So that's what it looks like. And what we do is we do make sure we are doing that in a gradual way. So a lot of sessions are spent doing what we call exposure ladders. So we're kind of laying out different scenarios and different exercises for confronting that anxiety. So we don't throw people in the deep end right away. We say, okay, well, what's something we could try that's going to make us a little bit uncomfortable, but it's manageable, right? And then we practice that until it gets a lot easier to do.
And I think that hopefully reduces a little bit of that stress and that
Hmm.
anticipation coming into a treatment like that, that you're
Yep.
not just going to jump to the deep end. This is
Hmm.
all very much reminding me that OCD is an anxiety condition.
Hmm.
And it sounds like there's some similarities in treatment to maybe how we would approach, let's say, a height phobia, a fear of heights. That similar to that idea, you're not just going to take somebody and put them up on an airplane or put them on top
Exactly.
of a
Yeah.
tall building. That's too
Hmm.
much too fast. That
Yeah.
invokes all of those old protective and defense mechanisms that are there. However, at the
Hmm.
same time, at some point, that person is going to need to get to the top of that tall building or onto that airplane in order for their life to feel like it's starting to open up again. So I think you described that
Hmm.
idea of the ladders being that we work from where things are now and keep challenging it just out of the comfort zone to build more
Hmm.
tolerance and build more capacity. And it sounds like that's where more freedom, more quality of life start to open up for people once again. Hey?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it can be a gradual process, right? Sometimes people have quite a few themes. And that's okay, right? Because I just go back to, okay, yep, we just treat it the same way. So we might be having, multiple exposure ladders for, different areas. And exactly what you said. We start with, okay, what's pushing you a little bit outside of your comfort zone? And then we continue to practice that. And what's really cool about it is that it gets easier, right? We want you to be doing it so much that you're actually bored, right? We're doing an exposure and then you're going, oh my gosh, I just don't want to do it because I'm bored. I don't want to have to do that thing again, right? Yeah, exactly. And that's great, right? We want you to get to that point because then it's not we're avoiding it because of anxiety, right? But yeah, it's a very cool process. Hard, but it's very cool.
Hmm.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on the self-help side of OCD treatment? So
Mhm.
even if someone understood some of the principles of exposure response prevention, or maybe we're accessing other self-help materials, like let's say some workbooks that are out there, what have you seen? What advantages do those offer? And then where can those maybe reach a point where they're not quite as helpful for people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What I've noticed in doing this work is a lot of clients, like you said, they start to understand the principles behind this. And so a lot of what I do, I help people a lot at first with getting the ball rolling. But then what I've noticed is, people start to get a sense of how to just kind of experiment with it and implement it in their own way, right? Like I'll have clients say, "Oh, look at listen to what I did," right? And they do, clients are smart, right? They can notice how to apply it in their own life, right? So I do see that happening a lot. But yeah, like I think another piece is people can create their own kind of exposure ladders after we do some work. But yeah, there's also, if you're wanting to kind of continue on your own, there are definitely a lot of kind of workbooks, a lot of just books about OCD, and a lot of them do have yeah, like they kind of take a self-help narrative. So they'll have a lot of kind of exercises, or they'll show different examples of exposures. Some of them talk about exposure scripts, which is actually another part of treatment, which is basically, what are you telling yourself while you're doing these exercises? Are you reassuring yourself? Are you, trying to make it better? Or are you saying, no, I'm tolerating uncertainty. I'm leaning into this uncertainty. Something might go wrong while I'm doing this, but that's okay, right? So scripts are kind of another component of treatment. But yes, there's lots of those available. One of my favorites that I've learned a lot from is, let me just double check that I'm having the right title here. Um, so the author is Jonathan Grayson, and his book is called Freedom from Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder. And I've learned a ton from that book. There's lots of, they go through lots of different common themes and give examples of how you can just apply that in your own life. So yeah, I find a lot of the time our work can kind of get the ball rolling for people, and then there's lots you can be doing on your own to work through some of that.
And what about people who haven't done any treatment or therapy and maybe
Mhm,
aren't quite ready or aren't willing or aren't able to? Do you feel like these sorts
mhm.
of self-help resources are a helpful place to be?
Absolutely.
Nice.
Like I do think I've noticed, I've noticed a lot of people have hesitation, right? They come in, and that's a really important thing to consider, is like, oh my gosh, that's going to be really hard, right? And that's okay, right? This can be a long journey for people, right? So I think even just starting with, like I said, self-awareness is great, right? Sometimes we just talk about, okay, how is this showing up for me? Even just starting to identify, oh, okay, well, that's probably a compulsion, right? So that's probably something that is reinforcing my OCD. So even just starting to be aware of that, that can be a really big part of the process too, right? Just understanding, oh, okay, this is maybe perpetuating the cycle, and learning about it is awesome, and it's a really good place to start if you're feeling that hesitation.
Nice. I like that's encouraging and realistic. And I
Mhm.
think the bottom
Yeah.
line is we always just want to meet ourselves where we're at, right? So looking
Mhm.
at what are you experiencing? What do you currently know about what you're experiencing? And where do you feel drawn to go next? And maybe that's
Mhm.
look up some resources online. Maybe it is to go read a book. Maybe it's to grab a workbook and start doing some
Mhm.
more hands-on activities. Maybe it's to start surveying different therapy providers in your area. Wherever you're at, I think any of it is part of the change process. It's not all going to happen at once. And I think we all go through all of those different sorts of actions as we're moving through that process of change. So I think that's a
Mhm.
encouraging message to remember no matter where you're at, just do whatever you're feeling drawn to do next. And if you're really
Mhm.
feeling stumped, that can be the place to start to reach out because maybe someone outside of yourself, maybe a healthcare provider or maybe even a trusted support person, a loved one, or a therapist might be able to offer some suggestions or feedback because sometimes we get a bit clouded living with ourselves all the time, and it can be helpful to have that objective perspective, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely, really good point.
Nice. So, as we come to the end of our episode, I think I still feel like I have a bunch of questions, but that's okay. We don't want to talk for hours and hours and hours. Or maybe we do, but we'll save
I
the
could
listeners. I know
probably.
we'll have you back again. We need to keep talking about this, but
Yeah.
for now,
Yeah.
just curious your final thoughts. Anything that you would like to convey or say to the listeners? Maybe it's someone in the audience who is wondering if they have OCD or knows they do and are struggling. Just what would be any messaging that you'd like to send their way today?
Yeah, really good point. I think just what I'd want them to know is there are things you can do to make it better, right? I think OCD is it's really distressing and it can feel really sticky and hard to push through. But, even just, speaking off of something Paige mentioned is whatever stage you're at, there's solutions, right? There's lots to learn about it, and there are lots of strategies to, make it better, right? And so if you're curious, like Paige said, there's lots of self-help books out there. There's lots of, resources. And, I know some of them we have on our website, but yeah, don't give up hope, right? I think sometimes it feels like it's never going to get better, but there certainly are things to be done.
Love that. Always love the
Mhm.
messages of hope because I think
Yeah.
that's what we need on especially those darker and internally gloomier days where we might
Yep.
not be feeling that way. And even
Mhm.
from a therapy perspective, like I can speak from a non-specialist in OCD side that I have had people come into my office and I've realized that they had OCD and they probably were not, well, I know they weren't getting the best treatment from me. We created referrals, we created other pathways for them. But I wonder if there's people who've been sitting in an office somewhere and maybe that didn't
Mhm.
happen. And so they were left thinking,
Yeah.
is this it? Is this the
Yeah.
best that it's going to be? Because it
Yeah.
is a very specialized and niche field and does require
Totally.
that specialized training. And so
Yeah.
if that wasn't present in the space where you were, that may not be a totally accurate representation of the treatment or therapy experience. So I always say to
Absolutely. I
people, you can try again, right?
yeah, absolutely. I do think it's a really important point is, yeah, finding that person that specializes, right? Because I agree, sometimes there's approaches that actually backfire when you have OCD. So yes, I agree. Take your time and like Paige said, try again. Couldn't agree more.
Love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing a small glimpse of your expertise, your knowledge, your wisdom. I can hear the people that work with you are in wonderful hands, and I
Mhm.
appreciate your willingness and your openness to spread this information. So I would love to have you back in the future to talk more about OCD in more specific ways and keep opening up
Mhm.
that dialogue. But in the meantime, people are more than welcome to find Megan Hanrahan at her practice and work with her. And as she had mentioned on the Sana Psychological website, you can see the anxiety and OCD tools and resources that we have to share. I know that that Jonathan Grayson book that you mentioned is recommended on there, thanks to you. And there
Mhm.
are other ones as well for people to check out. So wherever you're at
Yeah,
in your journey, keep searching, keep listening to yourself and what you need. And thanks again, Megan, for being here. Really appreciate it.
absolutely happy to join, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Take care and we'll
Okay.
talk soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Sana Psychological Podcast. We're glad you joined us today. For more resources, free tools, or to book a session with our team, visit sanapsychological.com. Your mental health is our priority. Until next time, be gentle with yourself and take good care.